I looked at this in a while. When we last looked at Mark, we looked at a little section in which Jesus leaves Israel, goes off to a Gentile region, and we called that section Compassion Grows, because it is Jesus bringing compassion to a whole new group of people. It's a short section in the Gospel of Mark, but chronologically, it's actually a large section through the last little bit of chapter 7 and the first little bit of chapter 8. It was just a few sermons in our series, but it actually encompassed possibly as much as 1 year of Jesus' life. Now, if you think about it, his ministry is about 3 years. This is about 1/3 of his ministry gets mentioned in just a couple of verses. It was probably a very critical time for Jesus, but it's a very short thing there. So now we come to a new section where Jesus is revealed. That's what we're going to call it. It's going to last a little bit longer. It's going to take us pretty much through till Easter. And hopefully, I have no promises, but I hope by the time we get to the end of this, it will not be -40 wind chill. Let's hope for it anyways. We get to the end of April, we have this long section, Jesus revealed. But I'm going to tell you the most important thing to know, Jesus revealed. We've already kind of had some sections where Jesus is being revealed to people. But now is something special. Jesus returns to Israel. He becomes the center of attention of the public. But it is not Jesus revealing himself to people at large. This becomes a very specific set in which Jesus reveals himself in a special way to his followers. Why? So that his followers can go out and reveal Jesus to the world. There are things that get in the way sometimes of our Christian life, and sometimes they're very subtle. I read a story this week that I'm quite sure is not a true story. It was purported to be, but I'm quite sure it can't be. At least I hope it's not. And it was a story of a very wealthy young lawyer who, sometimes happens, made a lot of money very quickly as he got out of school. And as he made his big bucks, he went out and he spent lavishly. And he had fun spending. And he went out and he bought himself the brandest, newest, fanciest BMW he could find. And he took it on a drive. It was through the mountains, through a kind of a bit of a windy spot with some curves on kind of icy conditions. And before he knew it, he lost control of his brand spanking new BMW. And he was in an accident. How exactly it worked, I wasn't sure by the story. But anyways, he wasn't properly buckled in. He went flying. But not all of them went flying. His arm got caught and it got severed at the shoulders. First gentleman who stopped was a trucker who witnessed the accident, stopped, jumped out, saw the man who was still awake and conscious in a state of shock, crying out, "My new BMW! What's happened to my new car?" And the trucker looked at him. And he looked at the severed arm and said, "You know, you've got a bigger problem than the car." And the man, for the first time, coming a little bit out of his shock and realizing that he lost his arm, started to call out, "Oh no, my new Rolex." Hopefully none of us have a materialistic attitude that is snuck in like that. But you know what? There are subtle attitudes that sneak into people's lives that end up changing who they are. Do you think that lawyer would have set out to be the kind of person who what they cared about when their arm gets severed is their watch? And something so unimportant as that. But you know what? Subtle little attitudes tend to sneak into our lives. And they become a great distraction to the truth. Jesus turns his attention to his followers because there are certain things he does not want creeping into their lives. Jesus crosses across the lake. He goes to a place called Dalmanutha. In Sunday school today, kind of had a smaller group, so we played Bible trivia. Actually, we played Bible Jeopardy. So here's the big question. Where is Dalmanutha? Oh, nobody's going to speak up. Do you know what? That's good, because nobody knows. It's in the Bible. The best guess is it might be a nickname for another town. Maybe it's a town that has a little village that hasn't been identified. But it's a little place. And Jesus is just passing through. They're on their boat. They're traveling. They're heading towards their town in southern part of Galilee. They get out of this town. They're going grocery shopping. They got to get some supplies. And the Pharisees hear he's back. Now, we don't know if he just stopped real quick to get groceries and there were some people in town who were on top of him. Or maybe they stopped and they stayed a couple of days and some Pharisees came from the area. But whatever the case may be, they rush over and right away, remember he's been gone for almost a year, maybe even a full year. They rush over. I'm sure the question is, so where have you been? Oh, well, we've been over there, across the lake. We've been up in Lebanon, traveled all through there. What? You were traveling in the Gentile areas? You weren't with us? What? What's wrong with you? How could you do that? How could you do that? We're going to talk about bread today. We're going to start with the flour. There's a confrontation going on here. Sin is a big focus of the Pharisees. And boy, they think Jesus blew it. Well, what do you mean you've not been with us? Because the basic bottom line is they weren't with them. Yesterday morning, as often happens on Saturday mornings, I got up, I made waffles. Usually I make pancakes, but yesterday morning was waffle day. It just seemed appropriate. And in our house, often Saturday morning I get up and make the breakfast. And I got talking, I forget even who I was in conversation with recently, but I was in conversation about the pancakes I make. And talking about how I make the pancakes and that, I said, well, the key is I've got a secret ingredient. And if I told you this, I'm sorry, because I can't remember for the life of me who I told this to, but we were in conversation. I said, well, I've got my secret ingredient. And whoever it was said, okay, so what's your secret ingredient? The problem is you can't reveal secret ingredients up in front of everyone, can you? Especially considering we're recording this to go on the internet. So the whole world will know my secret. But I'll tell you what, as long as everybody promises not to give it away too much, I'll give you the answer I gave that person. My secret ingredient is flour. It goes really good in pancakes. Nobody's laughing. I thought that was not the obvious ingredient. Flour is kind of the key ingredient, isn't it? It's not really so much a secret ingredient. Flour is the key thing in all that, because if you don't have that, all you kind of got is mushy, I don't know, I don't even know what hardened it all. The Pharisees were quite convinced. They were the flour for the bread of Israel. Why were they so worried about Jesus? Why were they so worried about this sign? Because they had to be there. Why? So that when Jesus gave his teachings, they could either approve or disapprove of it. That's why the Pharisees had to be there. How else could they judge him if they didn't hear him? And they were the ultimate ones to understand what was right and wrong. And they were upset with Jesus, and they asked him for a sign that he was right to go to the Gentile areas. And he says none will be given. Now, if you read Matthew's gospel, Matthew adds a little addendum. He says there is one that will come later, and it's the resurrection. But Mark skips over that part of it. And the bottom line is this: they are looking for the spectacular to prove that God is with Jesus, because they thought they were the spectacular and God was with them. Can God be with the ordinary? Go to Banff or Jasper. Drive through the mountains. Don't you just feel the grandeur of God? It's the grandeur of God in a prairie landscape. You look at a spectacular sunset, and boy, there's God. But how about at 10 o'clock in the morning on a gray February day? Is God there? Do we find God in the ordinary? I was reading this week, the success of our Sunday worship is measured by how well you worship on Monday. Monday's the ordinary. Sunday's the spectacular. Sunday's where you gather together to do something big, but God's in the ordinary. The poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning said this: "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries." In other words, comparing, of course, to Moses around the burning bush. And it's saying God's everywhere. God's in every bush. We just often miss him. And we need to be listening. God had done something for the Pharisees. God had worked in them as a group. And that was good enough. They weren't looking for more. Because God had done something, and now they were something special. They had something now to offer God. They now had something to offer the world. They were the special ones, and they had ceased to look to the special one from heaven. Now Jesus is kind of offer something to them. He had better be more spectacular to them, so they asked for a sign. I think Jesus' answer is something more along the lines of humble yourselves and understand you have lots to learn. They're not listening. He moves on. And he moves on rather quickly. And so we move to verses 14 and 15, which is where he starts talking about, beware this leaven, the yeast. The Pharisees. And he not only attacks the Pharisees, he mentions as King Herod. Yeast can work its way through the whole loaf, changing its makeup. If you have a loaf of bread, fresh out of the oven, smells good, you decide, you know what, I like the look of this loaf, but I'm not a great fan of yeast. I think I'm going to, after you cook it, say I'm going to take the yeast out. Is that going to work? You can't take an ingredient in after it's done. It doesn't work that way. It's so much part of the bread that it is there and there's nothing I can do to remove it. Yeast is always a symbol of sin in the Bible. It is always a symbol of sin. Almost always. Passover was all about baking bread without yeast. The Jews actually still have to this day a game they'll play at Passover where just before they'll hide little packages of yeast around the house, and the kids have to go with little brooms and collect all the yeast. It's almost like an Easter egg hunt. They go around and they collect it all up and they get rid of it because you can't have yeast in your house during a holy time of the year. It's a symbol. Is there anything wrong with it? No, of course not. But it's a symbol because it's something that works its way through all the ingredients and changes the makeup of what you're baking. Beware the Pharisees, those who think highly of themselves, think that they are good enough on their own to please God. Beware of Herod, who's the king, those who trust in their own might and their own power. These are hard lessons because they're about subtle attitudes that work through the whole being. You know, they both come down to, am I good enough on my own? This is part of materialism, where we trust and we care about things of this world. Focus on our own comforts, our own strengths, pride, strength. These things, they're hard to identify. When are you too proud? When are you too focused on the things of this world? I mean, it's a subtle thing. It's a subtle thing, but it tends to work throughout us. These Pharisees, these were students of God. But we start to see in them what happens when we focus too much on ourselves. They're always right. They argue fiercely against people who have different opinions. They're easily offended by others. Everything to them is personal. They have this subtle attitude that has worked through them that changes who they are. And Jesus gives them this warning, but the disciples don't get the warning. So that moves us from the yeast to the bread. Because, remember I said they were stopped to go grocery shopping. But when the Pharisees come along, and they start arguing, Jesus says, let's get out of here. But they don't get the grocery shopping done. They were supposed to pick up some supplies, particularly some bread. They'd forgotten it. And the disciples right away, well, he's talking about bread, and we forgot to get bread. He's got to be mad at us. Instead, he was pointing out a problem as well as a solution. He takes them as a masterful teacher and shows them the problem, but also gives them a solution subtly. This little attitude creeps in and causes problems in my life. Well, how do I fix it? Do you remember the feeding of the 5,000? Yeah. Do you remember the feeding of the 4,000? Yeah. He's suddenly bringing more bread into the story. And we're kind of left, he doesn't give us the full answer. So what is the full answer with this? Why would he bring out these two stories? Probably in about June. There's a couple of dates that might end up changing this, but about June, we're going to get to a story in the Gospel of Mark. It's a familiar story about a gentleman who's just called the rich young ruler. Know that story? He comes to Jesus. He says, what do I have to do to make it the kingdom of God? Jesus says, well, keep all the commandments. He says, well, I've done that. I'm pretty good. He says, well, then give away everything you've got. But he's rich. He doesn't want to give it away. And Jesus looks and says, look at this story. It's really easy for a rich man to go to the kingdom of heaven. That's not what he says. He talks about an eye of a needle. And he talks about a camel passing through it. We're going to get to that in June, what all that means. But everybody looks at Jesus and says this. Is there hope? This is impossible. This is a hopeless situation if this is true. And Jesus looks at them and says, nothing is impossible for God. That's the exact same answer he's given in this story today. There's this subtle attitude that has crept into the Pharisees' hearts. And he's warning them, don't become like this, but how on earth do we keep a subtle attitude from changing who we are? Do you know what? You or I can't do it on our own. None of us is good enough in ourselves. Well, we have a God who feeds 5,000. We have a God who feeds 4,000. We have a God who's all about the impossible. God, anything's possible. These subtle attitudes. If Jesus, however, can feed all these people, he can act in my life. The religious leaders, Herod, they're the most talented and the best of Israel. If they fail, what chance do I have? And the answer in Jesus is everything. The Pharisees, despite the fact they knew all about God, were living in unbelief. How do you safeguard against that? And the answer is simply this: belief. Faith. If God can do those feedings, the point was not about the spectacular. It actually pointed them towards the ordinary. It pointed them that on an average day, when attitudes and selfishness and struggles take hold, remember faith. Remember Jesus. Remember Jesus, because he changes everything. We need to keep our eyes always fixed back on Jesus. Otherwise, we slip into those subtle little attitudes. And those subtle little attitudes are just like yeast in bread. They work its way through and they change everything. Aren't you glad you have a God who's powerful enough to take the yeast out of bread? It's a simple thing for God. It's not the spectacular. But boy, it makes a difference. Prayerfully, always, look at the Jesus who changes our attitudes. We're going to do that and change our attitudes and look to Jesus in song. And I'm going to invite our worship team to come forward and we're going to look at sing hymn number 332.